October 15th, 2023, Detective Captain Elena Vargas had seen 1,000 arrests in her 34-year career. She'd never seen a man smile while being cuffed until tonight. The stranger claimed to be Pablo Escobar. Impossible. The kingpin died in 1993. But as officers Martinez and Santos loaded him into the patrol car, something in his eyes made Elena's hands shake for the first time in decades. "Captain?" the man called through the window, his voice carrying across the station parking lot. "Tell me, does little Sophia still take the same route to school?" Elena's blood turned to ice. Sophia was her granddaughter. Nobody outside family knew her name. Within 10 minutes, both officers were on their knees in the gravel, begging. The man was still handcuffed, still in the back seat, still smiling. What happened next would force Elena to confront a truth she'd buried for 23 years. Some debts never die. Some favors compound with interest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Elena's service weapon felt heavier than it had in years as she approached the patrol car. Martinez was still on his knees, tears streaming down his face, while Santos pressed his palms against his temples as if trying to stop his skull from splitting open. "What did he say to you?" Elena kept her voice steady, but her eyes never left the figure in the back seat. Martinez looked up, his face pale as moonlight. He knew about my daughter's surgery, the one scheduled for next week, the one I haven't told anyone about. Santos nodded frantically. He described my apartment, down to the color of my mother's rosary on the kitchen table. The man in the car hadn't spoken again since mentioning Sophia. He simply watched Elena through the reinforced glass, that knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth like he was enjoying a private joke. His hair was salt and pepper gray, his face weathered but alert, mid-40s maybe. He could have been any of 1,000 men walking the streets of Medellin, except for his eyes. Those eyes held depths that made Elena's chest tighten with recognition she couldn't quite place. "Get inside," she ordered her officers. "Write your reports. Don't mention what he said to you. Captain, now." Martinez and Santos scrambled to their feet and hurried toward the station. Elena waited until the door closed behind them before approaching the car window. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head, studying her face. "You've changed, Elena. The lines around your eyes are deeper. Worry does that to a person." Her hand moved instinctively to her weapon. "I asked you a question, and I'm giving you an answer. Just not the one you want." He leaned forward as much as the cuffs would allow. 23 years ago, you made a choice. A boy was going to die if you followed protocol. So you didn't." Elena's world tilted. The memory she'd buried clawed its way to the surface. Rain-soaked streets in Bogotá, a teenager bleeding in an alley, his handlers closing in. She'd been a detective then, young and idealistic, working a cartel case that had already claimed 3 informants. "You remember now." His voice was softer, almost gentle. "Diego Morales. 16 years old, bullet wound in his shoulder. You drove him to the border instead of processing him. Saved his life." The gun was in her hands before she realized she'd drawn it. Diego died. I read the report 2 years later. Cartel found him in Venezuela. Reports can be fabricated. Death certificates can be forged. New identities can be purchased. He spread his cuffed hands in a gesture of openness. "I had resources you couldn't imagine." Elena's mind raced. Diego had been different from other informants. Too smart, too connected, too dangerous to be just another street kid selling information for protection money. She'd suspected he was more than he claimed, but she'd been too focused on saving him to ask the right questions. "What do you want? To return a favor?" "You gave me a second life, Elena. Now I'm going to give you one. By threatening my family? By warning you." His smile faded. "The Herrera cartel found you 6 months ago. They've been planning ever since. Tomorrow morning, Sophia's school bus will break down on Calais 45. She'll accept a ride from a nice man in a blue sedan. By afternoon, they'll send you a finger." The world stopped. Elena's training screamed at her that this was manipulation, psychological warfare, but the details were too specific, too intimate. And deep in her gut, she felt the truth of it. Why would they? Because 23 years ago, you didn't just save a boy. You saved Pablo Escobar's nephew, his sister's son, the one person whose testimony could have brought down his entire network. Diego's voice carried no pride, only weary fact. Miguel Herrera has spent decades building his empire on Pablo's ruins. My testimony would destroy him. Elena lowered her gun, but didn't holster it. You're lying. Your mother calls you every Sunday at 9:15. She makes the same joke about your father's cooking. Sophia's favorite color is purple, like the bicycle you bought her for her 8th birthday. Your ex-husband remarried last spring, a dental hygienist named Carmen who laughs too loud. Diego leaned back. I've been watching over you, Elena, all these years, because you saved me when you didn't have to. The parking lot felt like it was spinning. Elena gripped the car door handle to steady herself. The officers who arrested me tonight, they're not on Herrera's payroll yet, but they will be by morning. Money has a way of changing minds. Diego's eyes met hers through the glass. You have a choice to make. The same choice you made 23 years ago. Follow protocol and watch innocent people die. Or trust the devil you saved. Elena stared at the man who claimed to be the boy she'd rescued. In the distance, a church bell chimed 11 times. What happens if I trust you? His smile returned, cold as winter rain. Then we disappear Miguel Herrera before he disappears your granddaughter. The weight of Diego's words settled over Elena like ash from a distant fire, each syllable burning through the careful walls she'd built around her new life. She stared at his face through the bulletproof glass, searching for traces of the terrified boy she'd pulled from that Bogotá alley 23 years ago. The mathematics of it made her stomach turn. If Diego was telling the truth, every quiet Sunday dinner, every bedtime story she'd read to Sofia, every moment of peace she'd carved from the wreckage of her old life had been borrowed time. 5 minutes, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. That's how long before I have to process you or release you. Diego nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. 5 minutes to decide if you believe the ghost you created. Elena holstered her weapon and walked back toward the station, her legs moving on autopilot while her mind reeled. Through the windows, she could see Martinez and Santos hunched over their desks, probably still trying to make sense of what had happened. The fluorescent lights inside cast everything in harsh relief, the familiar coffee-stained reports, the bulletin board with its faded wanted posters, the small framed photo of Sofia on her desk that suddenly felt like a target painted on her heart. The station had been her sanctuary for 8 years now, ever since she'd fled Bogotá with nothing but a transfer request and a desperate need to disappear. Valle de Aburra wasn't exactly peaceful, no place in Medellin's shadow ever was, but it was manageable. Small-time dealers, domestic disputes, the occasional robbery. Problems she could solve without wondering which of her colleagues might put a bullet in her back for asking the wrong questions. She'd rebuilt herself here, brick by careful brick. Captain Elena Vargas, respected member of the community. The woman who coached girls' soccer on weekends and kept a box of candy in her desk for kids who wandered into the station. The grandmother who never missed a school play or birthday party, who had finally learned to sleep through the night without checking the locks twice. Now Diego sat 30 meters away, claiming that life was built on quicksand. Through the window, she watched him in the patrol car's back seat. He wasn't struggling against the handcuffs or demanding a lawyer. He sat perfectly still, patient as a predator, occasionally glancing toward the street as if expecting company. The sight made her skin crawl because it felt familiar. The same watchfulness she'd carried during her last years in Bogotá, when paranoia had been the only thing keeping her alive. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter Carmen, Mom's asking about Sunday dinner again. Sofia wants to make dessert this time. Fair warning, she's planning something with chocolate and way too much sugar. Elena's throat tightened. Carmen had been 19 when Elena left the capital, old enough to understand that her mother's sudden career change wasn't voluntary but young enough to forgive the half-truths and evasions that followed. They'd grown closer during these quiet years, their relationship rebuilt on weekend dinners and shared custody of Sofia after Carmen's divorce. It was the kind of ordinary family drama Elena had once thought she'd never have. Arguments about bedtimes and homework, debates over whether 8 was too young for a cell phone. Sophia. God, Sophia, with her gap-toothed grin and fierce determination to read chapter books, meant for kids twice her age. The little girl who collected purple anything and still believed her grandmother could fix any problem with the right combination of hugs and ice cream. Elena's chest constricted as she imagined those small hands, pictured what men like Miguel Herrera were capable of doing to prove a point. The church bell tolled again, 11:15. Elena realized she was gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Martinez emerged from the station, his face still pale but determined. "Captain, should we start the intake process? The system's been slow tonight, but—" "In a minute." Elena's voice came out rougher than intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Have you had any contact with outside agencies about tonight's arrest? Anyone asking questions?" "No, ma'am. Just us and whoever called in the disturbance." Martinez paused. "Captain, what he said about my daughter, how could he know about the surgery? We haven't even told her grandparents yet." Elena studied her officer's face. Young, honest, the kind of cop who still believed the system worked more often than it failed. In Bogotá, she'd learned to spot the tells of corruption, the subtle signs that someone had been bought. Martinez showed no such signs, but Diego was right about one thing. Money had a way of changing minds, especially when children's medical bills were involved. "Sometimes people know things they shouldn't," Elena said carefully. "That doesn't always make them dangerous." But even as she spoke the words, her eyes drifted back to the patrol car, where Diego waited with the patience of a man who had already won. The station phone rang. Not the usual desk phone that handled domestic disputes and noise complaints, but the red emergency line that connected directly to Elena's office. The one that had gathered dust for 8 years, its shrill tone so unfamiliar that Martinez jumped like he'd been shot. Elena's blood turned to ice water. In all her time as captain, that phone had never rung. Not once. She'd sometimes wondered if it even worked, this relic from the station's connection to federal agencies and cartel task forces, connections she'd deliberately severed when she'd taken the position. Through the window, Diego's head turned toward the sound, and his smile widened. "Answer it," Martinez said, but Elena was already moving, her legs carrying her toward the station before her mind could catch up. The phone's metallic shriek cut through the night air like a blade, each ring another nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed piece. Inside the station, Santos looked up from his report, confusion written across his features. "Captain, I thought that line was disconnected." Elena pushed past him into her office, slamming the door behind her. The phone sat on her desk like a coiled snake, red light blinking in rhythm with her heartbeat. On the 4th ring, she picked up the receiver. "Captain Vargas." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Elena." The voice on the other end was silk over broken glass. Cultured, patient, deadly familiar. "It's been too long. Miguel Herrera." Even after 23 years, his voice could still make her skin crawl. She'd heard it in wiretapped recordings, in testimony from terrified witnesses, in her nightmares during those first months after fleeing Bogotá. "Miguel." She kept her tone neutral, professional, even as her free hand moved instinctively to her service weapon. "I thought you were dead." Greatly exaggerated, I'm afraid, though I appreciate the sentiment. His laugh was soft, amused. "I see you've arrested an old friend of ours tonight." Elena's eyes moved to the window where she could see Diego in the patrol car, still watching the station with that knowing expression. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't, just as you didn't know who you were helping all those years ago in that Bogotá alley." The humor vanished from Miguel's voice. "Did he tell you? About his real family? About what his testimony could do to my organization? He told me you're planning to hurt my granddaughter." "Planning?" Miguel tisked softly. "Elena, my dear, you misunderstand the situation entirely. Planning suggests future tense. Sophia's already missing, the world tilted sideways." Elena gripped the edge of her desk as the room spun around her. "You're lying." "Carmen called the police 20 minutes ago. Her daughter never came home from her friend's house. Strange thing, the friend's family says Sophia left on time, but she never arrived home. Security cameras show her getting into a blue sedan at the corner of Calais 45. Elena's vision blurred at the edges. Through sheer force of will, she kept herself upright, kept her voice level. "What do you want?" "The same thing I wanted 23 years ago, justice for the crimes committed against my family. Pablo Escobar destroyed everything I built before his nephew's testimony could destroy him. Now that nephew sits in your custody, probably spinning the same lies that made you betray your oath the first time, I want proof of life." The line went quiet for a moment. Then, faintly, Elena heard a child's voice in the background, scared, confused, calling for her grandmother. Sophia, her little girl, asking why the nice men wouldn't let her go home. "She's unharmed," Miguel said. "Frightened, certainly, but unharmed. How long she remains that way depends entirely on your next decision." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of history crushing down on her shoulders. 23 years ago, she'd saved a boy's life and destroyed her own in the process. Now that same boy sat outside, offering salvation with one hand while holding a knife to her family's throat with the other. "You have 1 hour," Miguel continued. "Bring Diego to the old sugar mill on the North Road. Come alone, trade his life for hers, and this ends tonight. And if I don't, then you'll learn what Pablo's family felt when they found pieces of their children in unmarked graves." The line went dead. Elena set the phone down with trembling hands and stared at her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, hollow-eyed, ancient, carrying the weight of choices that had seemed so clear 23 years ago and now felt like chains dragging her toward an abyss. Outside, Diego waited in the patrol car, and Elena finally understood the truth that had been staring at her all along. There was no going back to her quiet life. There never had been. She'd been living on borrowed time, and now the debt had come due. The past had returned to collect its pound of flesh, and this time it wore the face of the boy she'd saved. Elena stood frozen in her office, Miguel's words echoing in her mind like gunshots in a cathedral. "Sophia's already missing." The phrase repeated itself, each syllable carving deeper into her chest until breathing became a conscious effort. Her hands moved without permission, fumbling for her personal phone, fingers trembling as she scrolled to Carmen's number. The call went straight to voicemail, her daughter's cheerful voice asking callers to leave a message, a recording from simpler times when the worst crisis in their lives was Sophia's refusal to eat vegetables. Through the window, Diego remained perfectly still in the patrol car's back seat, but something had changed. His earlier patience had shifted into something more predatory, as if Miguel's call had activated some internal countdown. He wasn't looking at the station anymore. Instead, his attention had turned to the street, tracking movements she couldn't see. Elena tried Carmen's number again. This time it rang twice before her daughter's voice came through, tight with barely controlled panic. "Mom? Thank God. I've been trying to reach you. Where's Sophia?" "I don't know." Carmen's voice cracked. She was supposed to come straight home from Maria's house after dinner. That was 3 hours ago. Maria's mom says she left on time, but... A sob broke through. "Mom, something's wrong. Sophia would never just disappear. She always calls if she's going to be late." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of a world tilting off its axis. "Did you call the police?" 20 minutes ago. They're treating it like a runaway situation. They want to wait 48 hours before..." Carmen's voice dissolved into frustrated tears. "She's 8 years old, Mom. She doesn't run away. She won't even sleep without her stuffed elephant. I'm coming over." "No." The word came out sharper than Elena intended. Through the window, she watched Martinez approaching the patrol car, probably wondering why they hadn't started processing their prisoner. She lowered her voice. "Stay home. Keep the doors locked. Don't let anyone in until I get there." "Mom, you're scaring me." "Good," Elena thought. Fear might keep you alive. But she couldn't say that. Couldn't explain that their quiet family dinners and weekend soccer games had been built on foundations of sand, that every moment of peace had been borrowed against a debt she'd never known existed. "I'll explain everything soon. Just stay safe." She ended the call and immediately tried Sophia's number, a concession to modern parenting that Elena had resisted until Carmen wore her down. The phone rang endlessly before switching to an automated voicemail, Elena pictured the small purple case that Sophia had insisted on, probably lying abandoned in some stranger's car or discarded on a roadside. Outside, Martinez was talking to Diego through the car window. Even from this distance, Elena could see her officer's posture changing, shoulders tensing, hand drifting toward his weapon. Whatever Diego was saying, it was having the same effect on Martinez that it had earlier on Santos, that look of a man realizing the ground beneath his feet wasn't as solid as he'd believed. Elena's desk phone rang, the regular line this time. She answered on the first ring. "Captain, we've got a problem." Santos's voice was strained. "I just got off the phone with the federal database. Our prisoners' fingerprints, they're not in the system." "What do you mean?" "I mean they don't exist at all. No criminal record, no identification, no military service. It's like he's a ghost." Santos paused. "But there's something else. I ran his face through facial recognition, and the system flagged a match from 1993. A cartel surveillance photo from Medellin." Elena's blood turned to ice. From when in 1993? December, 3 weeks before Pablo Escobar was killed. Santos's voice dropped to a whisper. "Captain, the photo shows him at Escobar's birthday party. He's standing right next to Pablo, and he looks exactly the same age as he does now." The impossibility of it made Elena's head spin. If Diego was 16 in 2000 when she saved him, he would have been 9 years old in 1993. But Santos was describing a photograph that showed him as a grown man, unchanged by 30 years. "Send me the photo," Elena said. "Already did." "Check your email." Elena's computer screen flickered to life, showing a grainy surveillance image from 3 decades ago. The quality was poor, the faces partially obscured by shadow and distance, but there was no mistaking the figure standing beside Pablo Escobar's unmistakable silhouette. The same salt and pepper hair, the same knowing eyes, the same ageless face that was currently watching her officers with predatory patience. Her hands shook as she reached for the emergency phone, needing to call Miguel back, to demand answers, to somehow fix the impossible equation that Diego represented. But before she could lift the receiver, the station's front door opened. A man stepped inside, tall, thin, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in their small-town station. Elena had never seen him before, but Martinez and Santos both went rigid at his appearance, their faces draining of color. The stranger didn't speak to her officers. He simply smiled and walked toward Elena's office, moving with the confidence of someone who owned whatever room he entered. Outside, Diego's head turned toward the station entrance, and for the first time all night, his expression showed something other than calm control. It showed fear. Elena's hand froze on the emergency phone as the stranger's footsteps echoed through the station. Through her office window, she watched Martinez and Santos exchange a look that spoke volumes. Whatever was happening, her officers knew more than they'd let on. The man in the expensive suit knocked once on her door before entering without permission. Up close, Elena could see the careful details that marked him as cartel money. The Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people made in a month, the watch that gleamed like liquid silver, the manicured hands that had never held anything heavier than a signing pen. But it was his eyes that made her skin crawl. They held the same calculating emptiness she'd seen in men who could order executions over breakfast. Captain Vargas. His accent was pure Bogota elite, the kind of cultured tone that had once intimidated rookie cops into looking the other way. "I'm Alejandro Mora. I represent certain interests that have been monitoring your situation tonight." Elena kept her hands flat on the desk, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to reach for her weapon. "I don't know what situation you're referring to." Mora's smile was winter thin, the same situation that required Miguel Herrera to make a rather urgent phone call 20 minutes ago. He settled into the chair across from her desk without invitation. "You see, Captain, tonight's arrest has created what we might call a logistical problem." Through the window, Elena could see Diego watching the station with renewed intensity. Whatever fear had crossed his face was gone now, replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. Martinez stood beside the patrol car, one hand on his radio, clearly torn between protocol and something else entirely. "The man you're holding," Mora continued, Has been dead for 15 years. That's impossible. Is it? Mora reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully, and produced a manila folder. He placed it on Elena's desk like a dealer laying down a winning hand. Diego Morales, officially killed in a car bombing in Cartagena, 2009. Closed casket funeral. Death certificate signed by the coroner. Case closed. Elena's hands trembled as she opened the folder. The death certificate was there, stamped and official, alongside photographs from the bombing scene. Twisted metal, charred concrete, a crater where a car had been, and beneath that, a coroner's report describing remains so badly damaged that identification had relied primarily on dental records. Dental records that were provided by Miguel Herrera's organization, Mora said quietly. A convenient fiction that allowed a very dangerous young man to disappear from the world. Why? Elena's voice came out as a whisper. Because sometimes, Captain, the only way to keep someone safe is to make them officially dead. Diego had testified against 13 cartel bosses by the time he turned 25. Half of South America wanted him in the ground. Mora leaned back in his chair. The question is, what could possibly convince him to resurrect himself after all these years? Elena stared at the photographs, her mind reeling. The boy she'd saved in that Bogota alley had grown into a man who destroyed entire criminal organizations with his testimony. Someone so dangerous that faking his death had been the only way to keep him breathing. You, she breathed. Me? He came back for me. The realization hit her like a physical blow. 23 years I've been running from that night, and he's been out there somewhere, officially dead, watching, waiting. Mora's expression shifted, and for the first time, Elena saw genuine concern flicker across his features. Captain, if Diego Morales willingly exposed himself after 15 years of perfect invisibility, if he allowed himself to be arrested by your officers, then whatever he's planning, it's worth dying for. Outside, Martinez's radio crackled to life. Elena watched her officer's face go pale as he listened to whatever dispatch was telling him. He looked toward the station, caught Elena's eye through the window, and his expression told her everything she needed to know. More bad news was coming. The child, Mora said softly, reading her expression. Your granddaughter. Miguel told you she was missing. Elena's throat constricted. Where is she? I don't know. But I know Miguel Herrera, and I know his methods. Mora stood, smoothing his jacket with practiced ease. He's not the kind of man who makes idle threats. If he has the girl, he'll use her. To do what? To make you choose. Mora moved toward the door, then paused. 23 years ago, you saved a boy's life. Tonight, you have to decide if you're willing to sacrifice your granddaughter's life to keep him alive. Elena watched him go, her mind spinning through impossibilities and half-truths. Through the window, Diego sat perfectly still in the patrol car, and she finally understood what she was seeing in his expression. It wasn't fear or resignation. It was guilt. The same guilt she'd carried for 23 years, the weight of choices that rippled through time like stones thrown into still water. Diego hadn't come back to destroy her life. He'd come back to save it, and that terrified her more than anything else. Elena burst through the station doors, the night air hitting her face like a slap of reality. Her feet carried her toward the patrol car before her mind had fully processed what she was doing. Martinez stepped aside as she approached, his earlier confusion replaced by something that looked almost like relief, as if he'd been waiting for someone else to take control of a situation spiraling beyond his understanding. She yanked open the car door. Diego looked up at her with those impossibly calm eyes, and Elena felt 23 years of carefully constructed lies crumble around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. Tell me the truth, she said. All of it. Now. Diego's handcuffs clinked softly as he shifted position. Which truth would you prefer, Elena? The comfortable one you've been living with, or the one that's going to destroy everything you think you know? Miguel doesn't have Sofia. The words came out before Elena fully understood what she was saying, but the moment they left her lips, she knew with crystalline certainty that they were true. Diego's micro-expression confirmed it. A tiny flicker of surprise, quickly masked, but not quickly enough. Miguel Herrera died 6 months ago, Elena continued, the pieces falling together with sickening clarity. Liver cancer. I read about it in the intelligence briefings. You've been using his identity, haven't you? The phone call, the threats, that was you. Diego was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. Miguel died owing me a favor. Several favors, actually, including the use of his name when the situation required it. Elena's vision blurred at the edges as the full scope of the deception hit her. Where is my granddaughter? Safe, with Carmen, probably doing homework or watching cartoons. Diego's expression softened slightly. I needed you to understand the stakes, Elena. I needed you to feel what I felt that night in Bogotá when you held my life in your hands. The ground seemed to shift beneath Elena's feet. Everything, the arrest, the phone call, her desperate fear for Sofia's safety, had been an elaborate manipulation. But as the shock faded, it was replaced by something far more dangerous: rage. You made me believe my granddaughter was kidnapped, she said, her voice deadly quiet. You made me listen to what I thought was her voice, scared and crying for me. A recording from her school play last month. Carmen posted it on social media. Diego met her eyes without flinching. I told you I was good at research. Elena's hand moved toward her service weapon before she caught herself. Around them, Martinez and Santos had backed away, sensing the volatile charge in the air between their captain and the man who was rapidly revealing himself to be something far more dangerous than a delusional vagrant. Why? The word came out strangled. What could possibly justify? Because in approximately 4 hours, Miguel Herrera's real associates are going to kill your daughter and granddaughter, Diego said quietly. And the only way to prevent that is if you help me die. Again, the world tilted sideways. Elena gripped the car door frame, fighting to stay upright as her mind struggled to process this new impossibility. What are you talking about? The man who just visited your office, Alejandro Mora. He wasn't lying about representing certain interests, but he wasn't telling the truth about which interests those are. Diego's voice took on the flat professional tone of someone delivering a tactical briefing. Miguel Herrera kept detailed records of everyone who ever betrayed his organization. Your name is in those files, Elena. So is Carmen's, so is Sofia's. But Miguel is dead. Miguel is dead. His successors are very much alive, and they've spent 6 months consolidating power by eliminating everyone on Miguel's revenge list. You were supposed to die 3 weeks ago, but someone warned them that Diego Morales might be alive. They decided to wait to see if the infamous ghost would surface to protect the cop who saved him. Elena felt the last of her strength drain away. She sagged against the patrol car, finally understanding the trap that had been 23 years in the making. You're bait. I'm bait, Diego confirmed. But here's what they don't know. I've been hunting them for 6 months. I know where they are, how they operate, who they trust. The arrest tonight was never about being captured. It was about getting close enough to the station to access your secure communication system. To do what? For the first time all night, Diego smiled, and Elena saw the boy she'd once saved flickering behind the man he'd become. To call in a favor from some very unpleasant people who owe me their lives. By dawn, Miguel Herrera's successors will be dead. Your family will be safe, and Diego Morales will be buried for good this time. And if your plan fails, Diego's smile faded. Then we'll all learn that some debts can never be repaid, only transferred from one generation to the next. Elena stared at him, finally understanding that she'd been wrong about everything. He hadn't come back to destroy her life or save it. He'd come back to finish it. The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut wire, 23 years of unspoken history crackling in the humid night air. Elena felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not the crushing weight of fear she'd carried all evening, but the familiar steel that had once made her one of Bogotá's most decorated detectives before corruption and compromise had driven her into exile. Get out of the car, she said quietly. Diego raised an eyebrow. Elena. Get out of the car. Now. Her voice carried the authority she'd buried beneath years of small-town politeness and careful invisibility. Martinez. Uncuff him. Her officer hesitated, hand hovering over his keys. Captain, I don't think— Officer Martinez. Elena's tone could have frozen blood. Remove the handcuffs from our guest. Then you and Santos are going to take a very long coffee break. Don't come back until I call you. Martinez looked between Elena and Diego, clearly weighing his training against the unmistakable command in his captain's voice. Training lost. The handcuffs clicked open, and Diego rubbed his wrists as he stepped out of the patrol car. Boys, Elena said without taking her eyes off Diego. Coffee. Now. Santos and Martinez exchanged glances before retreating toward the station. Elena waited until she heard the front door close, leaving her alone with the ghost who had haunted 23 years of her carefully constructed peace. You want to call in favors, she said. You need access to our secure communications. Fine. But we're going to have a conversation first, and this time, you're going to tell me everything. Starting with why that photo Santos found shows you standing next to Pablo Escobar, looking exactly the same as you do now. Diego's expression flickered. Surprise, calculation, and something that might have been respect. That's not a conversation I expected to have tonight. Neither was learning that my granddaughter wasn't really kidnapped, but here we are. Elena crossed her arms. You've been playing games with me all evening, Diego. Making me dance to music I couldn't hear. That stops now. Some secrets carry weight, Elena. More weight than you might want to bear. I've been carrying secrets for 23 years. I think I can handle one more. She stepped closer, and for the first time all night, Diego actually stepped back. That boy I saved in the alley, how old was he really? Old enough to know better. Young enough to think it mattered. Don't. Elena's voice cracked like a whip. No more riddles, no more manipulation. How old were you that night in Bogota? Diego was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried decades of exhaustion. 38. The number hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd carried the image of a terrified 16-year-old boy for over 2 decades, had justified her choices by telling herself she'd saved a child who deserved a chance at redemption. But the man standing before her had been older that night than she was now. You let me believe you were a kid. You wanted to believe I was a kid. It made the choice easier. Diego's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. You needed to see someone worth saving, Elena. So I became someone worth saving. The cartel members who were going to kill you. They knew, didn't they? They knew exactly who you were. They knew. Diego looked toward the station, where Alejandro Mora's expensive car still sat in the parking lot. I'd been undercover in their organization for 3 years. Deep cover. So deep that when everything went sideways, my own handlers couldn't extract me without blowing the entire operation. Elena felt the last pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, each revelation more devastating than the last. You weren't an informant. You were a cop. Federal. Anti-Narcotics Division, the youngest agent ever assigned to deep cover operations. Diego's smile held no warmth. Also the most expendable, apparently. When the cartel discovered the leak, my superiors decided it was better to let me die than risk exposing their real assets. The betrayal in his voice was so profound that Elena actually felt her heart ache. She'd spent 23 years believing she'd made an impossible choice between duty and conscience, but the truth was so much worse. She'd saved a fellow officer while his own people abandoned him to die. The testimony you gave later, the 13 cartel bosses. Revenge. The word came out flat and final, against the cartels who tried to kill me, and against the system that threw me away. I burned it all down, Elena. Every contact, every operation, every carefully laid plan that my handlers thought was more important than my life. Elena stared at him, finally understanding the man she'd created with her choice that night. Not a reformed criminal, but a weapon pointed at the heart of everything that had tried to destroy him. And now you want to finish the job. Diego nodded toward the station, where shadows moved behind the windows. One last time. But I can't do it alone. Elena stared at Diego, feeling the weight of 23 years collapse into this single moment. The night air around them seemed to thicken, charged with the electricity of truths that could no longer be contained. She had carried the image of a frightened boy for more than 2 decades. But the man before her was something else entirely, a weapon forged in the fires of betrayal and abandonment, tempered by years of careful planning. "You want me to help you die again," she said, her voice cutting through the humid darkness. "But this time, you want to take everyone else down with you." "Not everyone, just the ones who matter." Diego's eyes held that familiar steel, but now she could see the exhaustion beneath it, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had been running for far too long. Miguel's successors aren't like the old cartels, Elena. They're surgical, efficient. They don't leave loose ends. And we're loose ends. We're the loose ends that started it all. The cop who chose conscience over duty. The agent who burned down the system that betrayed him. Diego glanced toward the station where Mora waited. They've been patient, methodical. But patience has limits. Elena felt the familiar weight of her service weapon against her hip, the same reassuring presence that had anchored her through years of impossible choices. But tonight, she realized, the choice wasn't impossible at all. It was heartbreakingly simple. "Show me," she said. Diego's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features. "Elena, you said you needed access to our secure communications. You said you had favors to call in." Elena's voice carried the authority she'd learned in Bogotá's blood-soaked streets and perfected in this quiet town where she'd thought she could finally rest. "Show me what you really came here to do." For a moment, Diego hesitated, and Elena saw something she hadn't expected. Genuine vulnerability. The mask he'd worn all evening slipped completely away, revealing not the calculating manipulator or the dangerous ghost, but the exhausted man underneath who had been carrying his own impossible burden. "If I do this," he said quietly, "there's no going back, for either of us." There was never any going back. Elena moved toward the station, her steps sure and measured. "That ended the night I pulled you out of that alley. We've just been pretending otherwise." Inside the station, Alejandro Mora looked up from her desk with practiced calm, but Elena caught the micro-expression of surprise that crossed his features when he saw Diego walking freely beside her. Martinez and Santos sat at their desks with steaming coffee cups, their postures too rigid, their attention too focused on paperwork that didn't require such concentration. "Gentlemen," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of command, "I need the communications room cleared, now." Her officers exchanged glances before standing, their movements careful and deliberate. They understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the woman who had been their captain for 5 quiet years was revealing depths they had never suspected. "Captain," Santos began. 20 minutes, Elena said. "Don't let anyone in, don't let anyone out." When her officers had gone, Elena turned to face Mora, who had risen from his chair with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. "You can go too." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Captain." Mora's smile held no warmth. "My employers are quite specific about observing the outcome of tonight's activities." "Your employers," Diego said, moving to Elena's communications console, "are about to become very unhappy with the quality of intelligence they've been receiving." Elena watched Diego's hands move across the equipment with practiced efficiency, entering codes and frequencies that should have been impossible for a civilian to know. But then, Diego had never been a civilian. He had been one of theirs, abandoned and betrayed by the very system Elena had served faithfully until conscience forced her to choose otherwise. "The favors you mentioned," she said as Diego worked. "Who exactly owes you? Remember the 13 cartel bosses whose organizations I destroyed?" Diego's fingers danced across the keyboard with surgical precision. "Some of their rivals are still alive, still grateful, still very, very dangerous." Mora's careful composure cracked. "You can't seriously be planning to call in 23 years of accumulated debt?" Diego looked up from the console, and Elena finally saw the boy she had saved that night, not in his features, which had been weathered by time and violence, but in his eyes, which still held the desperate hope of someone who believed justice might still be possible, to balance the scales one last time before the ledger closes forever. Elena felt her own choice crystallizing, as clear and inevitable as it had been in that Bogota alley. She had saved a man who had dedicated his life to fighting the same corruption that had driven her from everything she knew. Tonight, she would save him again. "Do it," she said. Diego smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all evening, and reached for the transmit button. The transmission lasted exactly 47 seconds. Elena watched Diego speak in rapid coded Spanish to voices that crackled through the static, his words carrying the weight of debts accumulated over 2 decades. Names she recognized from intelligence briefings, locations that made her blood run cold, promises that would reshape the criminal landscape of 3 provinces before sunrise. When he finished, the silence in the communications room felt absolute. "It's done," Diego said, leaning back from the console. The exhaustion that had lurked beneath his surface all evening finally claimed him, and Elena saw him as he truly was, not a ghost or a weapon, but a man who had just spent the last of his strength to protect people he barely knew. Mora's composure had completely shattered. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed." "I know exactly what I've unleashed," Diego replied. "The same thing that was unleashed on a 38-year-old federal agent in a Bogota alley 23 years ago. Justice delayed but not denied." Elena moved to the window, watching the pre-dawn darkness that hung over her quiet town like a shroud. In 6 hours, her officers would arrive for the morning shift. In 12 hours, the reports would start filtering in. Bodies discovered in safe houses across 3 provinces. Criminal organizations that had survived for decades, suddenly decapitated with surgical precision. "How long?" she asked without turning around. "Miguel's people? They'll be dead before the sun comes up." Diego's voice carried finality. "Your family will be safe, Elena. That debt is paid. I meant how long before they come for us." Diego was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, Elena heard peace in his voice for the first time all evening. "They won't. This ends it, all of it. The favors I called in tonight weren't just about eliminating threats. They were about ensuring that Diego Morales disappears from every database, every file, every whispered conversation, in every back room where dangerous men make dangerous plans." Elena turned to face him, finally understanding. "You're buying your way out." "I'm buying our way out. Both of us." Diego stood slowly, moving like a man who had finally set down a burden he'd carried too long. "After tonight, Captain Elena Vargas will be just another small-town police chief with an unremarkable record and an unremarkable life. The woman who saved a federal agent in Bogota will be a ghost story, if she's remembered at all." Mora laughed, but the sound carried hysteria. "You think you can just walk away? You think after everything you've done, everything you know?" "I think," Diego said quietly, "that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can become is invisible." Elena felt something shift in her chest, not the weight of fear or the steel of command, but something lighter, something that felt almost like hope. For 23 years she had lived in the shadow of that single choice, always waiting for the consequences to catch up with her. Now, finally, she could see the end of that long road. "What happens to you?" she asked. Diego smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "I disappear, completely. Diego Morales dies for the 3rd and final time, and someone else gets to figure out what kind of man he wants to be. And if I need to find you, you won't." Diego moved toward the door, pausing only to look back at her with something that might have been gratitude. "But if you ever do, if the quiet life you've built here isn't enough anymore, there's a small cafe in Cartagena that serves excellent coffee and asks no questions about the past. The owner there understands second chances." He was gone before Elena could respond, slipping out of the station and into the pre-dawn darkness as quietly as he had arrived. She stood at the communications console, staring at the equipment that had just reshaped the criminal underworld of half of Colombia, and felt the strangest sensation of completion. Outside, she heard a car engine start. Not Mora's expensive sedan, but something older, quieter. By the time she reached the window, the taillights had already disappeared into the maze of streets that led away from her small, perfect town. Mora sat slumped in his chair, staring at his phone with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. "They're already moving," he whispered. "All of them. How did he—" Elena holstered her weapon and walked to her desk, settling into the chair that had been her anchor for 5 peaceful years. In a few hours, Martinez and Santos would return with questions she couldn't answer and reports she wouldn't file. The sun would rise over the mountains that sheltered her adopted home, and life would continue its quiet rhythm. But for the first time in 23 years, Elena Vargas would sleep without ghosts. "Coffee?" she asked Mora, who was still staring at his phone in shock. "I think," she said when he didn't respond, "it's going to be a very long morning."